How's it going, guys? Welcome to the Talk4 Podcast. So excited to have you here today and show you this fantastic episode. Just want to say quickly that episodes like this one and all the ones before and the ones in future are made possible by people who subscribe. Hopefully, just like you. I'm going to ask you today if you can leave a subscribe, leave a follow, leave a rating, leave a like or a comment, and just support the show in the little ways that you can like that. It makes a huge difference on my end. And quickly, just want to plug as well. I've taken 30 of the best episodes of this podcast and turned them into a fantastic book that goes into 150 secrets to greatness. Each one of those 30 episodes gets crunched down into 5 of the best key takeaways from the whole talk and turns them into a fantastic book. Highly recommend you check it out. Please support the show by grabbing a copy, either a paperback or an ebook. And I can't wait to show you guys this one today. So guys, without further ado, let's get over to the episode. How's it going, guys? Welcome to episode 142 of Talk4, the Quickfire podcast, where we ask 4 great questions to unique and interesting people. Today is no exception. Behind the mic today is your host, Louis Skupien. That's me. Let me introduce our great guest for today, James Darcy, who's going to be answering our questions today. So, James, how you doing today? Welcome to the show. Honored to have you here. This is going to be a great chat. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, thanks very much for asking me to do this. Very impressed by what you've done with this podcast, and I'm happy to be a part of it.
Well, that's great. I'm super glad to hear it, and super impressed with everything you've done too. It's an incredible career. Everything you're doing right now and the things you've done before, equally just amazing. And I just can't wait to dig into it. But we've got to introduce you to the people first then. So we always have that kind of 1 minute, 2 minute elevator pitch before we get into the big questions. So just a little bit of a snapshot into the life of you, what you've got going on, what you've done, who you are, and yeah, just a little kind of nutshell of what you're up to. That'd be great.
Sure. So I guess the short version is I'm an aerospace communications and strategy consultant. That's what I sort of call my respectable day job, and my disreputable side hustle is I also have an air-to-air photography business. So on the communications and strategy side, I spent the last 25 years working in various leadership roles, primarily in communications, first on the military and government aerospace side, and then on the industry side with Airbus. And sort of a thread that was present through all of that work was air-to-air photography, which I first learned in a military flight test environment, continued to do for Airbus, and now do for corporate clients as my own business person.
Brilliant. That's a great pitch. So let's dig into the backstory then. So that's where we always like to start on the show, figuring out where things kicked off, just the whole journey through it all then. So your career spanned over 2 decades in communication, leadership, strategy, and tactics. It's all really impressive, but can you take us through your journey then from the early days of your career, starting with your time at the Naval Air Systems Command to your current role as the principal of Darcy Strategic then? So just kind of what were the kind of, what was that career path looking like for you? How did it all start? What the inspirations were, and any mentors along the way? So yeah, let's start there.
Yeah, so I always think these kind of life stories are a little like vacation photos. They're really interesting to the people who are presenting them, and significantly less interesting to the people who are maybe on the receiving end. So, I'll try to, instead of doing the whole proverbial photo album, just kind of pull out some snapshots, I guess. And maybe the first one is I'm in graduate school. I'm 2 years into a 5-year PhD program in developmental psychology at Cornell University, and I decide it's not what I want to do with my life, right? Fast forward, it's a couple of years later. I'm a photojournalist on an Army newspaper, and wondering sort of how I got there and what I'm doing there, and kind of making a mess of things. Calling the command sergeant major of the military district of Washington master sergeant, and just feeling clueless and out of my depth. And fast forward another couple of years, and now I'm sitting in my car, and I'm at a stop sign, Naval Air Station Patuxent River, to yield the right of way to an FA-18 Hornet from the test pilot school that's taxiing across the road in front of me. And by now I've decided that I love working for the military, and looking at that plane taxi by in front of me, I decided that aerospace is something that I want to be part of my life and my career for the rest of my life. So, go forward another couple of years, and I'm doing public affairs for programs like the V-22 Osprey. And that's everything from, talking to reporters about the return to flight to hanging out on the back ramp of a V-22, 200 feet over the New Mexico desert with a Discovery Channel producer, and she's shooting video and I'm shooting stills, and can't believe I'm getting paid for it. Other interesting moments, we'll call them, like hanging on a rope 150 feet under a search and rescue helicopter to do a story about search and rescue swimmers. And the helicopter starts giving up all its oil in the number 2 engine, and the engine starts to seize up. And later I find out the crew chief's got his knife out, and because he's decided that if when they dump the nose to gain altitude, it's going to drag us through the treetops. He's going to cut us loose so that we have a relatively quick and clean death by falling 100 feet instead of getting beat to death by being dragged through the treetops. And that's another day where I'm sort of going, I can't believe this is my job. That story obviously, wound up with a happy ending. By 2009, I was leading communications for Navy Marine Corps aviation programs. And it was, in many respects, a dream job. It was a very senior role, and I was working in an organization that, represented everything that I thought was exciting about aviation and aerospace. And so I left. And I was comfortable, and I decided to jump out of a perfectly good airplane into corporate life, and that's what wound me up at Airbus. First on the defense and helicopter program side, and then on the commercial aviation side. And in many ways, that was a traditional, corporate executive role. One day I might be on the set at CNBC with our global CEO and Phil LeBeau, and doing all the traditional corporate communicating stuff that you expect. But then there were these episodes interspersed in between, like in my last 2 weeks on the job at Airbus, I was in a hangar in Patagonia, and I'm in the back corner of the hangar helping my video crew move around these crates of equipment, because the South American equivalent of a honey badger had gotten into the hangar and was rooting around in our stuff, right? So we're dealing with the badger, and and I turn around, and behind me is this pressurized space glider, the Perlan 2 glider, that we're getting ready to go try to fly to the edge of space. And then behind that, out through the open hangar doors, is the helicopter that I'm going to go fly in the open door of 10,000 feet over the Andes, taking pictures of the space glider. And beyond that is, this crystal blue glacial lake and the snow-capped Andes. And I'm standing there thinking to myself, if I were doing corporate communications in any other field, if my job was to sell mops and buckets and floor polish, this would definitely not be the experience that I'd be having. And so in many ways, it was my dream job. I had that, and I had, and I had the big proverbial corner office with the great view. And, the last snapshot is 2 weeks after that, my going away party, because I'd already decided that I was going to leave. And again, I jumped out of a perfectly good airplane and decided it was time to create something for myself primarily in the consulting business, and haven't regretted it a day, haven't looked back, and have really, every time I've made an uncomfortable choice to leave something that felt comfortable to me, it's been the right decision, and that's proven to be the case this time as well.
I think that's quite interesting there, and I want to dig into the mindset of that just slightly too, because a lot of people have careers where they are in jobs that they hate, or they are really comfy, but they, maybe somewhere deep down there they're destined for a bit more, or they know they're not quite following their passion or something, and all that, but they never do what you did. They never, execute on that thought, and they never go and leave it because they're quite comfortable and there's safety and comfort. So I guess, what was your mindset towards that? And if you were talking to someone right now who was in that kind of a position, maybe where you were, where they thought there's more for me out there, but I'm also really comfortable right now, how do you kind of weigh up the pros and cons of that and commit to that decision well, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a little like in aviation, understanding the role of fear as a tool versus as something that gets in the way of execution, right? So there's definitely an element of fear that comes into saying, "Hey, I'm going to leave the predictability of a stable corporate job and the institutional security of working for, um, I was leading communications for the largest aerospace company in the world in the US and Latin America. And I had great people around me, and I had this amazing company around me, and I had all of this security and protection and predictability. And so there was a lot of fear associated with the idea of leaving all of that behind. And it's that kind of, finding that balance point to, when is fear holding you back from something that you need to do versus when is it protecting you from something that you shouldn't do. And finding that line is, I think, leaving was not an emotional decision for me. It was something that I thought about and planned and had a strategy for the better part of a year, and something that I wanted to do the right way to leave the company in a great place. And Airbus was my first client when I left Airbus. I still love that company and all the people there, but um, I think for people, you talked about people doing jobs that they hate. Um, I didn't hate my job. I just was having to choose between I could either be really excellent and engaged in my professional life, or I could be really excellent and engaged in my personal life and my family life. And the two were starting to get mutually exclusive because, at the level I was at in the organization, it was a very demanding job. And I just woke up one day and, I was seeing people in amazing jobs, like on the Perlan Project. And I know we'll talk about that a little bit, but, that space glider, people who were at the top of their careers doing incredible things, and they weren't having to make the sacrifices. They weren't having to choose between living a fulfilled life and also being able to achieve excellence in their field. And so that kind of inspired me to say, okay, well, as long as you're willing to go out and accept a certain degree of risk, there's no reason I have to choose either.
Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. I really appreciate the insights there, and I think maybe one of the things I'm taking for that too is that I don't know if it's Hollywood or if it's social media that's given us this kind of an impression of leaving your job to go and do something new is kind of like a dropping a bombshell on your boss and leaving like a horrible letter, or pulling your pants down and walking out the front door kind of a thing. But I think that's what social media's done to our heads a bit. But you're right, it's got to be strategic. You've got to have a plan. So how did you kind of plan to do that? Did you obviously have everything lined up first? Were you going into a bit of an unknown there with those new ventures? Yeah, how did you kind of structure that and mitigate as much risk as possible when you were doing it, and kind of lace a few lessons into there too from what you did?
Yeah, so first of all, I had been working with a professional coach over the years just to help me be better at my job for Airbus, and that was something I was doing, personally. It wasn't something through Airbus, and um, and we were having a lot of discussions around just kind of what an ideal career path and an ideal life really looked like for me. Um, and I have to say, to Airbus's credit, they did a lot of kind of executive leadership training around leading with purpose and connecting your sort of purpose on a personal level with what you did professionally. It just so happened that for me, being very introspective about purpose made me realize how important it was to be more present for my family, and how I was, there would be weeks where no matter how many hours I put in, and no matter how hard I tried to balance things, I knew I was either going to feel like I was failing in, meeting commitments to my family, or I was going to fail in giving my absolute best to my employer, to Airbus. And it wasn't really fair to either side. And frankly, it wasn't fair to me. It just wasn't what I wanted my life to be. So there was some purposeful planning around, building some financial cushioning. I wasn't, from an ethics standpoint, I couldn't be out there trying to, find clients in advance. So I knew I was going to start from a blank slate. And that was going to bring with it a certain amount of risk, and there was going to be kind of a ramp up. And I got great advice from a friend of mine who's been in business for himself for a lot of years, because I said, my thought is I will build in these off ramps, and if I haven't reached, this level of income or revenue by, this point in time, then, maybe that'll be a trigger for me to, go start exploring other corporate full-time positions. And, then I'll build in this second off ramp and the second milestone. And he said, that's a terrible idea. He said, don't do that. That's an awful idea. He said, the minute you start giving yourself a way out when it gets hard, you're not going to do what's necessary to make it work when it gets hard. And he was right. And there have certainly been times, as you're building something for yourself, when you just sort of hit these points of going like, okay, this is no kidding, getting a little bit challenging. And then, knowing that I was fully committed, knowing that, this was something that I believed in and I was going to make it work no matter what, forces you to do the things outside of your comfort zone that, that you really need to do to make it work.
That's great. Thank you. I think that's fantastic advice and really appreciate you sharing that insight there. So, moving on then, so let's talk about the big one, the Perlan Project. So you've been involved guiding strategy and the communications there, which kind of achieved the it didn't kind of it achieved the world subsonic altitude record in an engineless zero emission aircraft. I've been looking into it recently. I think the whole thing there is just incredible. Like, what an amazing initiative, and the strategy behind it. It's all amazing. But we've got to ask then, so what unique challenges did you face in communicating the significance of this achievement? And how did you kind of craft a narrative that highlighted the innovative and groundbreaking nature of this project, basically? So how did communications look for doing this, and how did you get it out there? Yeah, talk to me a bit about all of that.
Yeah, so, the Perlan Project, I first got involved with it because Airbus was a title sponsor. And, it's probably fair to say that when that organization first approached us and said, hey, we want to fly a glider to 90,000 feet, we thought they were crazy. It sounded impossible. It should be impossible. There was a healthy amount of skepticism. And then we looked into it and realized that, there were some truly brilliant minds in aerospace behind this. The project was started by kind of a very famous NASA test pilot, a guy named Einar Enevoldsen, contemporary of Chuck Yeager back in the day. And he had this vision. He'd seen scientific data that there were these areas of lift called stratospheric mountain waves in certain parts of the world, near the polar regions and mountainous areas, where you'd have these rising columns of air that could go up to 120,000 feet. And he was a test pilot who flew literally hundreds of aircraft over his career, but he loved flying gliders, and he thought, wouldn't it be neat to see how high you could go in a glider in these stratospheric mountain waves? And so he first did it in an unpressurized glider with the famous aviator and adventurer Steve Fawcett wearing, pressure suits, spacesuits. And they got to, I think, about 54,000 feet and said, we really need a pressurized aircraft, and then began to develop what you see today if you go look for pictures of that aircraft. So Airbus came on as a title sponsor, and the first thing we realized was that Perlan Project was primarily a volunteer organization. So they didn't have a sophisticated communications office or really anyone doing communications. And if we wanted to tell this amazing story of what they were doing and our involvement with it, we were going to have to tell that story ourselves. So that really just began this process of working with them to understand, who they were and why they were doing this, and where we could relate what they were doing to people's interests and passions. And, that's kind of an underlying philosophy, I guess, in all strategic communications. Is like it's never about what you care about. It's never about what you are interested in. We are always infinitely more fascinated in the details of our own stories, our own products, whatever it is, than the external audiences that it's important for us to influence. And so, that was the first part of it, was going, okay, well, how do I take this very complex technical sort of thing of, interactions between the polar vortex and, stratospheric winds, and make that relatable and understandable. And part of the mission for that project was to inspire kids, right? So, how do you get school kids to care about this? And the way that Perlan Project did that was by carrying experiments in its science bay from like elementary school children. So on one hand, they were doing sophisticated, climatology research, and on the other hand, they were doing an experiment to see what happens to a marshmallow in outer space, and teaching kids about scientific hypotheses. And we're literally taking marshmallows dressed in little spacesuits and putting them in the science bay of this space capsule with wings.
Hmm.
So, it was about finding those points of connection, stuff that people would care about, stuff that people could relate to. And then it was also visual storytelling, because you had this incredible setting. It's glaciers and the Andes at sunset, and this beautiful aircraft. And that is such an important part of, I think, bringing people into the storytelling, is just allowing them to see it, allowing them to understand it, showing pictures from the tail camera of the aircraft at 76,000 feet, where you've got the blackness of space and you can see the curvature of the earth, to really understand what that experience is all about. GoPros on the inside of the aircraft, so people could really understand what the pilots were experiencing in that extraordinary feat of aviation history.
It's incredible. It's so amazing. But you mentioned there that the original vision was to get to 90,000 feet. So whereabouts is that now? And kind of like, what is your level of involvement with that now? And how's communication going with it all?
Yeah, so the service ceiling is 90,000 feet. The highest flight so far was to 76,000. And that was in 2018. And then in 2019, we had what was called a sudden stratospheric warming. Basically, it just is a climate inversion, causes the polar vortex to stop doing what the polar vortex does, that allows us to reach those incredibly high altitudes. And so, I think that year we were like only flying to 65,000 feet, which, is still crazy, right? I mean, that's, you've got no engine and you're flying twice as high as the cruising altitude of your average airliner in normal operations. So it was still doing amazing things, still achieving some amazing scientific, research accomplishments. But that year we weren't able to get to 90,000 feet. And the window for doing these flights is about 2 months out of the year, when the conditions are right, that you can, these rising air currents go as high as we need them to go. And then we ran into COVID. And so COVID delayed the program for a variety of reasons for a few years. And what wound up happening was we found some really interesting projects. And by that time I was on the board of directors of the Perlan Project, so, and continue to be to this day. So, we were finding other really interesting projects to work on, like Project Blue Condor, which was an Airbus initiative to test the chemical composition of contrails produced by hydrogen combustion. So, so like last year, it was a decision, hey, we're going to focus on that research project because that's important science too. So, the world records are a compelling way to get people's attention. And certainly if we can fly higher than the SR-71 in a zero emission aircraft, that's going to say a lot about the potential of sustainable aviation, even just as a symbolic gesture. But at the end of the day, it's always been about the science, and as long as there's great science to be done, then we're happy to do that at any altitude.
I think it's so inspiring, and I can imagine just how great that's going to be for the gliding industry too, and how many kids are going to be inspired by that to take up gliding as well, and aviation in general. Got to ask them, what is the SR-71's record then? So what do you guys have to beat?
Yeah, so the official record, I think, is it's about 85,000 feet. I think maybe 84 and change. It's a little controversial for two reasons. One, that's not considered a certified record, according to the body, the international regulatory body that certifies world records. But there are also people who say, hey, that's the unclassified, and there's a decent chance the aircraft's gone higher. It's worth saying too, I guess, since I know you've got a pretty aviation focused audience. When we talk about these altitude records, we're talking about level, sustained flight, and controlled flight. So it's not, on a ballistic trajectory, something like what was it, the X-15 that went to, hundreds of thousands of feet, but was essentially operating like a rocket ship. This is you're able to maintain level flight and you're able to steer and control the aircraft. Which is remarkable because at 90,000 feet, the density of the environment is comparable to the environmental density on, or the atmospheric density on Mars. So it's no small feat to control an aircraft at that altitude.
It certainly isn't. It's an incredible project, and I think it's just so fantastic. And I can't wait to see how it progresses over the next few years, that's for sure. So next up, one of your key strengths obviously is crisis communications too. So you've led teams through challenging times, such as Airbus's internal and external communications during significant reorganizational efforts. So what are the most critical elements in managing communications during a crisis, and how do you maintain employee morale, customer confidence, and all these things during times of uncertainty like that? So I figured that would be something great to ask you. You're the man for it. So yeah, fire away.
Yeah, and there's a whole, whole books are written on the topic, right? So, summarizing it can be, you can risk oversimplification, but I would say generally, first and foremost, it's about acting with integrity and sincerity. I'll call out the CEO of American Airlines, Robert Isom, following the crash in Washington, D.C. Between the American Airlines passenger plane and the Black Hawk helicopter. The morning after that accident, if you go and look at how he addressed the media, he came across as a person. He came across as a sincere human being having real, genuine human emotions. And that I think is probably the most fundamental underpinning of any kind of crisis communications, is to act with sincerity and to be genuine and certainly to be honest. There's a tendency in a crisis to go defensive, to become insular. And especially when you don't have all of the information or you can't answer all of the questions, there's a tendency to want to go silent. And there's a real value to standing up and saying, I don't have all the answers for you. I can't answer all your questions, but you have my commitment that when we can answer your questions, we're going to do that, and we'll do it in a transparent manner. And the second thing I think is the discipline to follow the plan and to not panic. So, these don't listen to their experts. They make missteps, and then they go and they pay large PR firms a great deal of money to come in and tell them to do what was probably in their crisis communications plan all along, and what their expert communications council was telling them to do all along. Do we have the discipline to follow our crisis communications plan when things actually get tough? So that's probably lesson one. And then, the second thing, you never want to have an adversarial relationship with the media. And that starts before you ever have a crisis. So a good and healthy corporate communications program, organizational program, is building trusting and collaborative relationships with media in times when things are going well, when you don't have a crisis on your hands, so that when the crisis occurs, you actually will be given the benefit of the doubt, and you actually will be trusted to act with transparency. You need to view the media as a strategic partner when you're in a crisis situation. You have to understand they have different objectives than yours. That's not their job to protect your stock price. But if you have a trusting and respectful relationship and you understand what their needs are, they're much more likely to trust you and understand your needs, and come to some sort of a point of consensus where together you can tell a truthful story that, puts the company in the best position to maintain trust of customers and shareholders and the public.
Out of curiosity, what stage do you think of a company or a business or even like an individual should people start to worry about this kind of stuff then? So when it comes to like media relations, having a communication strategy and developing things like a crisis, you know, they say like some of the F-18, the books are written in blood, aren't they? The guidebooks, at the start it was a lot thinner than it was at the very end, or where it is now. You learn these things as you go, but in terms of like companies and people and entrepreneurs and people who are getting famous, etc., when do you think is the right time to start actually taking this seriously? Is it an early on thing, or is it something that you start to get into when you get into the high figures? Like, where do you start with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, first of all, anyone in aviation, full stop, any aviation initiative needs to have a crisis communications plan. And it can't just be a written plan. It has to be something that you practice for. And that's true of communications in general, but crisis communications in particular. So, something like the Perlan Project, actually, that was kind of I guess, a funny story. For the first flight of that aircraft, I was sort of primary media spokesperson for the media event we were doing around that. And I was also, because of my background in air-to-air photography, going to be doing the air-to-air photo video. And so as we were reviewing the crisis communications plan of, if something happens on the first flight of this unique aircraft, what are we going to do? It revolved heavily around me and how I was going to interface with the media as the spokesperson for Airbus and for the Perlan mission. And then we started talking about, well, what are the different scenarios under which something, really bad could happen? And about the only thing we could think of that, could credibly lead to a loss of the aircraft because of how extensively it had been tested and what a benign sort of flight regime it was for this first flight was a mid-air collision between the chase aircraft and Perlan. And I was going to be in the chase aircraft. So we realized that in the most likely scenario in which we would need to implement a crisis communication plan, the person who was responsible for talking to the media was not going to be around to do it. So we literally had to rewrite that communications plan to basically write me out of the picture. Now, the odds of something like that happening because of how carefully we planned and choreographed everything were extraordinarily low, and all of the risks were carefully managed. But it doesn't matter. You don't buy insurance because you plan on burning your house down, right? And you don't buy, if you think there's a 1% chance of, crashing your car, you don't buy car insurance for 1% of the value of the car. You sort of have to view it as binary, right? Either nothing bad's ever going to happen and you're never going to need that crisis communications plan, or something bad's going to happen and you're going to 100% need it. So you can't fake it. You can't shortcut it. You can't not take it seriously. And that's true no matter where you are in the aerospace industry and probably in a lot of other industries too.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But I guess the second thing I'd say is, approaching being in a great place to handle a crisis begins with having a great corporate culture and a great communications culture. So if you have open, honest, bi-directional, sincere communications with your own people within an organization, if you have open, honest, bi-directional communications with the media and all of the key strategic audiences outside of your organization, you will get through a crisis. If you don't have any of those things in place beforehand, if it's not fundamentally in your nature to have that kind of a culture of communications, either internal or external, you are not going to be able to fake your way through it in a crisis. And that's, I guess, maybe the bottom line is there's no crisis communication plan that's so good, and no communication executive who's so good as to be able to make someone who's an asshole not look like an asshole. And forgive me for being that blunt, but you see this, you see companies where they'll put forward an executive who you can tell has been trained to try to seem compassionate and sincere. but maybe this is a lesson for, corporate boards of directors. If you don't have a compassionate and sincere and genuine leader, there is nothing that your communications organization, your crisis comms plan, or your PR agency can do to fake that and make that person come across as sincere and relatable and compassionate.
So true. Like you said, I mean, you can't fake that. There's actually a vibe you get from people too, and you can sense when people are sincere and genuine and when they're just completely putting on some kind of a false,
Yeah.
facade to try and convince you of something. But so we're kind of in that actionable stage of the podcast right now where we're just kind of talking about how to actually get people to apply these sorts of things to and how people can actually genuinely benefit from this stuff then. So what does it take to actually design a good communication strategy then for a business that aligns with their goals, and also obviously kind of resonates with the stakeholders and customers too? So if you've got someone listening in right now, business owner, or someone in charge of communications, how would you go about beginning to design that? What are the kind of key components and fundamentals that you're going to need? And what's the strategy for getting that implemented?
Yeah, so you said it starts with the business objectives, and so many companies and organizations communicate for the sake of communicating. And every professional communicator that I know has been asked more times than we can count this question, or has received this request. I want a press release. And there's only one appropriate response when someone comes to you and says, I want a press release, or I think we should be on TikTok, or whatever it is, a tactic, which is to say, what is it that you were trying to achieve? And then, when you've identified the business objective, the next thing is to go, okay, well, who is it we need to influence to hold a perception or take an action in order to get to that outcome? And you can almost view it as like building a narrative, a storyline. You think of great business movies that you've seen, and or business books that you've read about big contract awards or big successes, and it's always this sequence of people taking actions that either move the company closer to or farther away from whatever that business goal is. So if you understand who the people are and you understand what the actions are that you need to influence, well, now you start looking at, okay, well, how can we motivate that perception or motivate that action? And now you're starting to tap into messages, and you have to do that with an eye toward understanding what matters to the audience versus what matters to you, and what's believable to the audience versus what's believable to you. And once you have that, now you can start to engage in a conversation around, all right, well, what's the right time to try to deliver those messages, and what are the right tactics? And by the way, 95% of the time, the answer to that is not a press release. So yeah, it's just that process of always making sure that any communications tactic, you can clearly state, I'm trying to deliver this message to this audience because I think it will produce this action or perception, which I need to reach this business goal. And if you can't line up that sequence for every single piece of communications, whether it's external or internal, then you shouldn't be communicating in that particular way at that particular time.
I like it. That makes a whole lot of sense. And the last one, to kind of put that on the flip side slightly, so that's how you begin that in the organization. But from a personal standpoint, for someone who's maybe, the next you going into strategic communications, or, a youngster who's looking to develop a skill set within this and go into it on the big scale and be really successful with it, what's kind of, what are the tools that you need on that Swiss Army knife to be really good at that job then? What should people start to develop early on? Any particular university or career path that they should go down to get the right skill set? What kind of experience? What should be on that Swiss Army knife of skills to be very good at the job that you did and do?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is approach communications like a science and discipline like anything else. There's a tendency to think, oh, well, anyone can be a communicator because, hey, we all communicate. And that's true up to a point. We just don't necessarily do it well, and we don't necessarily do it strategically or systematically. So whether someone has a background educationally in communications or public relations or something totally divergent. I mean, mine was in psychology, which I have found ways to apply, but it's more just about saying, okay, if I'm serious about this, I need to make this a study, to make it a professional discipline so that you have the credibility when someone says, I want a press release, to explain to them why that's the wrong thing to do and why it's the wrong approach to take. And if someone trusts you by giving you a business outcome they're trying to reach, you have to have the skill sets to be able to deliver the outcome that they're asking for. Otherwise, you revert to just being a service provider. So that's the first thing is, approach it as a discipline, whether you study it in school or not. And I did not. And the second thing I think is there are these core fundamental skill sets that will always be important. You have to be able to write. You have to, I think, approach communications with a sense of, again, I keep coming back to this idea of sincerity and genuineness. And that's a really difficult value to instill in a corporation or in a large organization. And it can seem at odds with being strategic, right? On one hand, I'm saying, well, communications is all about trying to achieve a business objective. But on the other hand, I'm saying, well, no, companies have to be honest and genuine and, and open. And it turns out that those two things are entirely complementary. You can't get to the strategically effective communications without approaching communications in a way that establishes credibility and trust. And that's the fundamental line that underpins all of it. And I think that's true in a career too. If you haven't established trust with the people within an organization, they're never going to turn to you and say, here's my business objective. Tell me what you can do to help me achieve this. And it's certainly true when you're out in the consulting world.
I love it. All right. Well, I think that's a great place to go into the shameless plug then. So let's find out a little bit more about where we can find out kind of more about all of this then, how we can kind of utilize you. So we always have that shameless plug moment at the very end after the 4 questions then, James. So your company, where can we find your stuff, the website, where can we kind of get in touch and start to develop our own communication strategies, and also like the Perlan Project too. So, shameless plug moment, take, a few minutes and promote everything you'd love people to take a look at, who've made it this far in the podcast.
Yeah, well, and first of all, thank you to anyone who's stuck it out this long. And I'm sure we can post URLs in the description below the video. But Perlan Project, it's an amazing project. If you want to learn more about that, it's perlanproject.org. If people want to have questions, want to talk about communication strategy, crisis communications, leadership communications, best way is probably to reach out to me through the website, which is darcystrategic.com. And then if they're interested in the air-to-air photography, whether they want to hire me or just because you love cool pictures of aircraft, that's 27rightphotography.com, 27right photography.com. And yes, it has something to do with runway 27 right at Heathrow. So there's a backstory there that I'll tell people if they really want to hear it and reach out to me. But otherwise, no, it's just, it's a pleasure talking to you. And again, I love that you've just taken your passion and interest in things and pursued it in the way that you have and with the degree of professionalism that you have, which, really comes through from the moment that you reached out to me through this podcast. So well done. And thank you for what you're doing and keep doing it.
That's fantastic. I'm so honored, so humbled, and speaking to people like you, it's a massive passion of mine. And, for people who listen to this, I don't know what day it's going to get published yet, but it's a Sunday right now. And honestly, there's nothing more I'd rather be doing than sitting here talking to some incredible people. And James, you've been just the best. I've learned so much from this podcast and I appreciate your time in a busy schedule. So, thank you for joining me today for the Talk4 Podcast, James. Absolute pleasure, and can't wait to keep avidly watching all the stuff that you're getting up to. It's fantastic. Thank you for this.
Thanks, Louis. Take care.
Awesome. And thank you guys for listening. This was episode 142. If you'd like to listen to the past episodes, go and have a look at the channel. If you'd like to listen to the future ones too, make sure to hit that subscribe button and spread some love by leaving a like and a comment. See you in the next one, guys. Fights on. See you there. Bye.